Okay, good morning. So, Hemshechayim Beis, we reviewed last week basically Maamar, the fifth Maamar, Shlach, beginning the discussion of the Esespheres Hagnuzis. So we're going to do some points from the fifth Maamar. We're going to go into the sixth Maamar, Kol Machlekes, which is the Keirach Maamar. Okay. Is this more or less what everybody's up to? Huh? People are moving along. You're able to move that fast. It's probably the most complex Maamar Chassidus that you're dealing with right now, especially as a Hemshech. Okay, fine. I'm impressed. Good. So, I think I've done enough overviews but I'd like to sum up because I think it's critical, because you can very easily lose the plot and the whole Hemshech Advarim and the flow. At the end of the day, it's all about a relationship with Eibishter. How do we individually and collectively and the world itself, Elam Hazeh, turn it into a Direlei Baruch? And at a personal level, how do you become Machan the Shiftecha, a person that has a relationship, a full relationship? To do so, you need a Mamutza. That's essentially the theme of all of Ayin Beis, really the theme of all of Chassidus and all of Kabbalah, really. It's all about creating some place we meet Elokus, so to speak. When I say we, I mean we as in the Yesh HaNivra. So obviously, we're given the plenty of tools to do so. We're Nivra b'Tzalmeinu Kidmusenu, as he's been explaining here. So the Rebbe Rashab in Ayin Beis, as you'll see as you continue to learn, really begins all the way at the top of the ladder and works his way down. The Elamis that Biyah, and especially the Asiyah and the Helamis and Simtsumim, you're not going to hear much about in the first volume almost. It starts much more in the second volume of Ayin Beis. When I say second, I'm talking about the first edition. Now it's already the fifth volume, whatever it is. Which is interesting. He's going, like I explained last week, it's like Mamayel Lamata. He's speaking right away, you see, immediately he's gone to Lifnei Tzimtzum Esespheres Hagnuzis. Yes, he's talking about Atzilus, but he's right away now established that Atzilus is mushrish, both the Eris and Kalim, the Kalim and the Keich HaGvul of Elokus, and the Eris and the Eir HaGvul of Elokus, all the way up to the Lifnei Tzimtzum, the Esespheres Hagnuzis. Now, why is this so important? Because if you can't connect to Lifnei Tzimtzum, then at the end of the day, there's going to be a ceiling of how deep we can connect with Eibishter. Like I said in previous classes, Shurim, that is there a ceiling? Because at the end of the day, the Beir and the Nivra are Ein Arich. And if there's a ceiling, so fine. But Chassidus does not want to have any limit. It goes all the way to the top. So that's why it's so important to establish that even Lifnei Tzimtzum, which means even before existence is Bechlal Shayach, that Arizal says, the Lashon and the Eitz Chaim, that Lifnei Tzimtzum was Eidin Sof Mamala Kol HaMetzias, the Ein Sinus Mokum, there's no Mokum, the Elam is Klal. That's why there's a Tzimtzum. In other words, it's not just a Havamina the Eibishter could just create. Of course, again, we're not talking about Kol Yochel. We have to always establish. We're not talking Kol Yochel. Kol Yochel, the Eibishter can do whatever he wants. We're talking about in some way that we should make sense, that Eidin Sof, the infinite light, should fill everything, and we should be able to, an independent entity, an independent consciousness should be able to exist. Is not possible. And yet, even there's already a sheidish for Acharat Tzimtzum. It's not a small chiddush. As a matter of fact, when you learn the Eitz Chaim, and even the early Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, you don't hear the Alter Rebbe talk about Lifnei Tzimtzum so much. There's here and there, the Mozim and the Rebbe Rashab and the other Rabbeim, so-called, find in the Alter Rebbe more about it. But the real Lifnei Tzimtzum discussions is mostly the Mittler Rebbe starts, Larichis, and the Rebbe Rashab, Tzemach Tzedek, of course, the Rebbe Marash, and the Rebbe Rashab in full glory. But you have to remember, Lifnei Tzimtzum is so beyond existence. The Alter Rebbe, when he would say Atzilus, he would tremble. Atzilus. And Atzilus is lower than Keser, and lower than the Kudim, and lower than Akudim, and lower than Ak, and lower than the Kav, and definitely lower than the Tzimtzum. And even that would cause the Alter Rebbe to tremble. So you can imagine Eidei Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. What would someone that really understands what kind of madreg you're talking about is b'chal, because Eidei Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum b'kitzur is essentially elikus, pure elikus. There's no Eidus, there's no Kalim, there's no levels altogether. Are you familiar with the Rebbe's letter from Tafshin Tes, where he's asked before the Nesias, how could you speak about levels Lifnei Tzimtzum when it's Eidei Sof Pashut? Anybody's ever seen that letter? It's printed in Nigros Kedesh in the early volume, in Chelik Beis probably, and also in the Kutei Sichos, Chelik Yud, Chelik Tezvav in the Hesofis, I believe. Yud Tezvav. Yeah, it's a very powerful letter. I'll just sum it up because it's going to be helpful to understand this Maamorim right here. So the Rebbe's asked the question, to say after the Tzimtzum Dargis, that's the whole point of the Tzimtzum, is to make levels and Dargis. But how could you talk about Dargis Lifnei Tzimtzum? Where do we talk about Dargis? So you hear the Lashenis, Etzem E'er, Ispashtus E'er, E'er Legalis La'atzmei, E'er Le'zulosei, the three levels, Rotzen HaKodum, Rotzen HaMuchlet, Rotzen HaKodum, all these Lashenis, Kedem Aleisa Rotzen, Sfira Saint Katz, all these levels that you learn about. And here it's all spelled out actually in Ayin Beis. So someone asked the Rebbe, how could you say levels before the Tzimtzum? So the Rebbe gives two answers. One, the Rebbe says, Bor B'Pashtus, Mesaso B'Pashtus, it's all the Fierech. Now, the Fierech La'achrei Tzimtzum is taken completely Pshitus. But the Fierech Atzmus, anything that's not Atzmus is already a Darge. So the Rebbe says, anything that's not Atzmus is already two Darges. Atzmus, and whatever's Nimshach Ma'atzmus. So even if it's Eidei Sof, Atzmus is not Mugdir and Eid, so that alone is B'Dakus Adarge. The Fierech Liv Achrei Tzimtzum is Pshitus. But the Fierech Atzmus, there's something there. Then the Rebbe explains it. He says, Be'emek Yeser. He goes deeper, and he actually gives some dugmois that make it more palatable. The Rebbe says that that Lifnei Tzimtzum, the Eir, even though it's Pashut, but it has in it all that will come after the Tzimtzum. However, Lifnei Tzimtzum is Nirgash, only Atzmus, only the Rotzen Hashem. And he gives a dugma. He says, for example, in mitzvahs, in halacha, there's a difference between a mitzvah kala, mitzvah chamura. Between halacha, between a daraisa, the rabbanon, a minig, and so on. These chilukim are emes chilukim. These halacha g'darim. It's not stam mitzad us. That's the Torah distinguishes between one another. Yet, a eved that's completely bottled to the rotzen, to the Baal HaRotzen, by him there's no difference. When you do it, it should be done with the Zel B'Tekev, Hakalik V'Chamura. Why? Because all of them are Rotzen Hashem. So the Tziyur is a difference. But mitzad the Bittul, it's all one. So Eidei Sof, the Rebbe says, Lifnei Tzimtzum is that darge. It's complete Bittul. So even though there may be the Mokir for all the darges that will come later, but they're Herzach only the Atzmus. That's what it means in a Sof Pashut. That's essentially what the Rebbe says. The Rebbe then ends the letter by saying, what does Tzarechim, what we still need Tzarechim, is what caused these dargis to begin. Because l'cheira, if there's no dargis, there's nothing to cause the dargis. So obviously there's an answer to that, and that's Keich Atzmus. But the Rebbe leaves it in that type of question. You can look up the letter. I just gave it up a kitzur, more barichas a bit in that Tafshin Tes letter.
What does it mean in Tafshin Tes? The Rebbe says that say that there's Tzimtzum before Tzimtzum Arish Musa Chiddush. You have different madrigas, you obviously have Tzimtzum between them.
It's because, and the Rebbe brings the Mekhedes from it. There are places it talks about, because the language, the fact that there is Dargas Lifnei Tzimtzum, that alone tells you there has to be Tzimtzum, because how do those Dargas go from one to the next?
Why the Chiddush?
The Chiddush, because you don't find the Chassidus talk about it directly, that there's Tzimtzum Lifnei. There's in Teda Shalom, he is there, and he brings some Anash Tashela. Huh?
There's dargas, there's obviously tzimtzumim.
That's the obvious, but it doesn't say in Chassidus that there's tzimtzum lifnei tzimtzum arish. When you say tzimtzum, it always means tzimtzum arish. They don't have Maamar. If you look in he brings there from Rabbi Shashelah. So Shashelah says clearly there's a tzimtzum before the tzimtzum arish. He uses that lashon. The Rebbe is talking about the lashon, not the havana. The havana there is, but that's a minyan that there is, so to speak. Now that's also a deeper concept. What exactly tzimtzumim means? Because in Inyan, is it Tzimtzumim or is the Eibush to be in Kevei Dargis? the bottom line is, it's very, if we were able to really talk about Lifnei Tzimtzum, means we're already not Lifnei Tzimtzum. That's meaning that we could talk about it means that we're not really touching it. It's time really more, I would say, we can imagine it if you wish. Because if we could talk about it, then why talk you need a Tzimtzum Addition? That's meaning that we can be there. Like when the Eibishter says to Moshe Rabbeinu, and I'll give you an example for this. I think I brought it. The Rebbe brings in Purim, Tainus Esther Memches. So the pasuk says, Moshe asked the Eibishter, Hareini nos chvedecha, which essentially means, I want to see your face. He wants to see Atzmus. Loshen Chassidus. The Eibishter says, Lo yireini odom v'chai. No person can see me and live. And then the Eibishter continues and said, V'isa es acherai, uponai lo yiro. You'll see my back, but not my face. That's the pasuk. The Rebbe asks, later we found it in Panim Yofis, actually, from the Baal HaFla. He writes almost word and word the way the Rebbe teaches it. The Rebbe asked 3 questions. First of all, what's Moshe's Havamin? Moshe doesn't know Lo Yireini Odom V'chai. Of all people, Moshe knows better than anyone that you can't, Ili Yadaiti V'yisiv is the expression. If I know God, I would be God. How could you see God's face? Remember, we're not talking about a sightseeing tour. Seeing God's face means that you're experiencing His essence. So Moshe didn't understand that. Secondly, since the Eibishter said no to him, why are we told? Every time the Eibishter says no to Moshe, we need to hear that Moshe is rejected. It's like Begenusen Shel Moshe. And the third question the Rebbe asks, what's the end? Why does the Eibishter have to rub it in? He already said Lo Yireini Odom V'chai. He has to say, Risis Achere. Fine. We have to tell him, Uponai Lo Yiro. But my face you're not going to see. So the Gemara in Berachos answers that says that when Moshe, the Eibishter is telling Moshe that when I wanted to show you my face by the sneh, you didn't want to look. Now, when you want, I'm not going to show you. Which, of course, the Rebbe doesn't speak about it in this sikh, but in another sikh. What is that? It's a game here. It's like, when you wanted, no. Now that when I wanted, you didn't want. Now when you want, I don't want. What is this? Like a husband and wife fighting about some, sounds like childish. So the Rebbe answers, a brilliant answer. He says, when you read the Ponai Ras'isa Sachere, Ponai Lo Yiro, you should read the pasuk like this: Ras'isa Sachere Uponai. You will see my back and my face. But Ponai, Ponai you will see by Lo Yiro, by not looking. In other words, this the idea Sachiyuv. There are things you can see. You see, for example, the Eibishter is being mashpia chesed, the chol chai. So that's a gili. So you could say that's a chiyuv that we relate to. That's like kurisa, but it's only achera. It's not etzem. It's not the ponai. Ponai, the only way to see it is through shlila, by not looking. If you want it, you can't see it. So what the Gemara in Berachos is saying, the Eibishter, when I wanted on my terms, that's when you would have been able to see me. Now you want it on your terms. That doesn't work that way. Because if it's you, it's not me. And if it's me, it's not you. In other words, you can't have both together. Peif and chiyuvi. Now the truth is, the Rebbe says in Sichos, he brings from the Rebbe Rashab, that through Chassidus you can come to Yadaita V'yisiv. I don't want to go there now. You could have even a chiyuvdik relationship with Atzmos. But the reason I'm saying this is because what do you see from this? That if you really want to appreciate Lifnei Tzimtzum, you have to realize Lifnei Tzimtzum is not even Ponai. Ponai would be Atzmos. Lifnei Tzimtzum is still Oir. And even that is not something that we really are shaykh to talk about, to experience, I should say. And yet Chassidus clearly talks about it. That's the Sfiras Hagnuzis and higher, because somewhat we can get some type of a taste in it, and that gives us like a episode musig that helps us understand these concepts. But you have to remember, Lifnei Tzimtzum basically is everything is on God's terms. It's not on our terms. There's no Bria yet. There's no creation. There's no Tzimtzum yet. Now, of course, I should always add, this is all conceptual. There's no before and after. Right now, there's a Lifnei Tzimtzum, and right now there's a Tzimtzum and there's a Kav. It's happening all the time. All these daragas are there. But the point is, that's a really other. So when you say Ein Lanu Esek B'Nistaris, the truth is, you can say it on all levels. But if any level, it's definitely these highest level. And yet, you see, Chassidus enters that zone, and the Rebbe Rashab does not hesitate to talk about it. Barichis Gdela here, and the main point, and let me bring it back to the Maamar here, to the Maimorim here, and that is, remember, how did he get to this? Because he's explaining how as Atzilus Gilead Helam or Yesh Ma'ayin, and he rejected that it's only the Kelim are Yesh Ma'ayin. He said the Eris are also Yesh Ma'ayin because Achachma Ma'ayin Temotzim. And yet there's also a Gilead Helam because the Sheirish Ha'eris And the tziyur of the Eir is mushrish in the Esses Firis Agnuzas Lifnei Tzimtzum. And like we discussed last week in the Maamar, the fourth Maamar, Shlach Maamar, he said clearly, that's why the Havamin and the Eitz Chaim is that it's possible that the Kav should have remained. How's that possible? Because the Kav is not a complete Chiddush. The Kav is already there, Behelim, in the Esses Firis Agnuzas. The main Ikar Tafkid of the Tzimtzum is for the Kalim, not for the Eir. So what that does is, suddenly we have now a bridge, which is a major Chiddush between Lachat Tzimtzum and Lifnei Tzimtzum. In other words, the Eidos of Atzilus can lead us straight to Lifnei Tzimtzum. I should qualify that, not straight. Kemuvin, there's a big Tzimtzum in between. But they can lead us there. There's a Mokir. What it means in Poshet to Baal Bata She'esius is that the Eibishter's connection to us is not just on our terms. You could say the Eibishter is like the Shalei Be'erech to Nivroim, Shalei Be'erech Legamri, but B'chazdei HaGodel, he chooses, like a father chooses to bend down to his son. So he gives us Atzilus and all the Elamis and the Sfiris, and that's where we relate to him. But if you're Etzem of Av or the Etzem of the Eibishter, it's not even the Av, you could say we can't touch that. That's the Eibishter's domain. When you say that Lifnei Tzimtzum, there's already something, however you explain that something, and we're going to discuss that now. That means that even in the so-called in Heichel Malchusei of the Eibishter, where there's Erein Sof, Poshet B'Tachlis Apshitas, and there's no Mokim Le'elamis, even there, when we say Ola B'Machshava, Yisrael Ola B'Machshava, the different Lashenis, Ola B'Ritzeinei, that means even in the so-called Godhead, if you wish, in a place where there's complete divine consciousness, and there's no room for anything else, even there's already the beginnings, the stirrings, or however you want to use the right words, for existence. And not just mitzad atzmus l'sava kadosh baruch hu liyas le'dir b'tachtenim. That, like a mashmal, atzmus could have a nesava in tachtenim. Even in giluyim, the giluyim of Eiris, the highest levels of Eir, that's completely bottled, talakus, where you'd think that there's no mesinas mokum for Eilamus. So how could there be a tziyur of Esses Firis Agnuzas? Even there, that exists. That's the main chiddush here in this section. It's not the only place in the Rebbe Rashab you'll find it, but there's no place that he elaborates like here. So that's bottom line. That's the nukudah here. Now we have the big dilemma, of course, and that's what he's struggling with the next, starting already in Maamar Shlach and goes on in Keirach. The dilemma is, I'm just going to use the Asius of the Rebbe Rashab, that since I just want to find the right Asius here. Since it's Tachlis Apshitis, actually, maybe here's the best Asius. I'm using from beginning of Perek Chof Aleph. It says, Omnam Adayin Tzarech Lovin, Eich Nemesh Esses Firis Agnus, Ein B'chinas Pshitis, Ari Esses Firis. So it's like a Cheres, a Stirim in Eibei. If you didn't say Esses Firis, you say that Gonuz B'teich Erein Sof is the Ola B'machshavte, the what will come later, like the Rebbe Rashab will bring later, a very popular moshel from the Magid the Rebbe often brings about the father's chokuk b'meche tzir of bnei. He imagines what his son will look like. You know the famous moshel. So there's no son yet. No one was born, but a father's mitzayah. So Chassidus brings from the Magid this moshel. So if you said that, fine. There it's on the tzir is all the same pshitas can also have. The Eibush has the ability to be mitzayah what it's going to look like. So it's not a true tzir, it's just his imagination, so to speak. The Lashon Shir Atzmei B'Keach sometimes. That's spoken about here as well. But you're saying there's Esses Firis. So how do you explain Esses Firis and at the same time it's called Gvnuzis? He says clearly, okay. So this is the dilemma that is now being covered. So I'm going to break it down. The Rebbe Rashab breaks it down into a few different ways of explaining it. First in Maamar Shlach, which we didn't discuss, and I said I would discuss today. He doesn't explain it, but he gives a dugma for it. He gives two dugmas in Perek Yutes. One dugma is from the Keiches Yulim, Keiches Atzmim within the Nefesh, and also the Dal Yusedis Atzmim, and the second is from the Reines Anishma V'Shemin Anira by Matan Torah. So for the first mashal, which I did touch upon, but I'll just say it briefly. So it's on top of page 9. Essentially, it's Perek Yutes. So what does he say? That when we have Keiches HaNefesh, a functioning, healthy human being, your Keich HaTnua is not your Keich seichel or koyach hamidus. There's different koyachs. Koyach hariyah is not koyach hashmiyah. Yet in the nefesh, can you say that if you opened up a soul, you'd find there riyah, koyach hariyah, koyach hashmiyah, koyach hamaisa, koyach hamidus? No, you wouldn't see that. It's all in some. In English, the word may be amorphous or nebulous. If you ever heard those words, sometimes the lashon is hiyuli. Hiyuli is very hard to translate. Mostly, best translation is potential. It's like a state where there's a potential state. He gives the example with the Daled Yesodis. You say Yesod ha'esh. Yesod ha'esh is not fire. It's what's called the archetype of fire. You're familiar with the word archetype? So in other words, let's put it this way. Momata l'mayla, I need to give this introduction. Momata l'mayla, we look at everything starts with that. See, we live in a world that's completely defined. Daimim is not semeach. Semeach is not chai. Chai is not medaber. A leopard is not a lion. A human being is not an animal. I mean, you have defined an apple tree is not an orange tree. Everything is tzir. We don't have a concept in Gashmis and Elam that we can relate to that is something that you say it's not defined. Is it a tree or is it a frog? There's no such language as shtusim when you talk in Elam Haza. But if you think in terms of, and this is more Dakosdika thinking, before it became a tzir prati, how was it when it was still bekeach? Like I mentioned the example of a seed. If you saw two seeds right now, right on this table, one is the seed of an apple tree and one is the seed of an orange orange tree, you probably wouldn't be able to see the difference. Even if you could see the difference, like they have a different color or they different shape, but you wouldn't be able to see this as apple. You're not going to see an apple in a seed. Even though I mentioned for the Rebbe, Friedrich Rebbe brings in B'yem Hasheni Pehei, that astrology, he brings there that scientists put it under the microscope, you can see some of the details. If you're able to see the one cell upon conception, when a husband and wife conceive a newborn, the moment of conception, when the seed is fertilizes the egg, and the Eibishter decides he's giving a neshama, what would it look like? And remember, scientists can have that one cell. They're able to see the moment of conception. First of all, it's so minuscule, the naked eye can't see it. Second of all, even what you see is, you see a life. You see the developed life, the complex life that all of us have today with all our neurosis and mishagas. Definitely not. Even, I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to all of us. Yeah, I see you smiling. And we don't see it. Why? Because it's in a state that it's not yet mitzuyah. Why am I giving these examples? Because you need to think about it. Because in Elam Haza, no one ever thinks of it that way. We think, I see a table, I see a chair, I see you, Reuven, Shimon, Levi. I mean, that's how it looks. So the same thing is, the truth is, in Ruchnis, Nishtalshus, Elamis, everything begins not as a mitzuyah dikadarga. First, it's in a level that's higher than tziyah. So when you say Daled, you say this, Eishruach Maamar. So it says the Daled Yitzuz Hayulim is not fire, water, air, and earth. It's archetypes. Archetype means it's a category. It's as a geder, the geder of Eish, the geder of Mayim. So in the language of Nigla. Once it's a geder, it's not defined. So that's why you could have Yishkenu Yachar, he says, opposites. Fire and water can't sit near each other. If you put fire and water, one of them is going to destroy the other. The fire will either evaporate the water will extinguish the fire. That's how it is. That's the nature of water and fire. But when you say this, water and fire, the archetype, there's a geder of Eish and the geder of Mayim. Why can't they be right within each other? And the same thing is with the Keiches Hiyulim and the Keiches Atzmim of the Nefesh. So if you go into the Nefesh, you don't necessarily see distinction. The distinctions come later, Dargis. So Chassidus has a whole Seder. It starts with Nefesh is a Poshet Tachas Apshitus, the Nefesh Adam. And that the Nefesh is Nesa Keiches. And then from Nesa Keiches is Keiches Aklulim Benefesh. And you have the Keiches Atzmim and the Keiches and Hilim and the Keiches Nalomim and the Keiches Gluyim. How many Dargis did I just say? 7 Dargis. See, and it makes sense because that's how, think of it, that first comes a complete state of Pshittas. Then that Pshittas is Nesa, the possibility of different levels. It would be like take a piece of clay, and you're going to shape it into a pot and into a cup. Now, if someone looks at the clay, all you see is it's just a raw piece of clay. There's no tziyur at all. Then suddenly you see a potter comes And what does he do? He suddenly you see a clay pot and a cup, a kos, and this and this. Where did this come from, you say? It was all there. Now, if you looked at the clay, could you see it? No, you don't see that. The artist, or in this case, the potter, he knows what he wants to create. He knows how to shape it into it. Now, this is not my mashal. This is actually the mashal of the Ramban, right in the beginning of Bereshis, where he says, Bereshis bara l'kim shemayim v'sa'aretz. Rashi says that everything was created in Bereshis. In Yom Rishon, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi was just a Gilead Helam from the Hiyuli of. That's where Hiyuli is introduced by the Rebbe Rashab. By the Ramban. There's maybe one of the first places it's used is right there in Bereshis. So now we understand. Now I'll give another example. Let's say you want to. It says in Chassidus that ein odem b'lei bayis. The Gemara says this. Chassidus explains because the rotzen mushrish be'etzem hanefesh, just like the Eibishter wants in Tzamach Gimel, Tafrei Tzamach Gimel, the Rebbe Rashab brings, that just as the Eibishter wants a dira b'tachtenim, he made b'tzelem elikim, we also have be'etzem, we need to have a dira. Ein odem b'lei bayis. A homeless person is not complete. Now, ultimately, it's having your own bias or your own land, ein odem b'lei karka. Now, you're born with that, rotzen, in your nefesh. Does a child know about this? Obviously not. You can go 20, 30 years, or whatever the amount of years, and never even know you have such a rotzen. Then, one day you're neseder, the rotzen bet neseder, I want to buy a house, or I want to build a house. Now, when you have that, even that, it's a posh, it's pshitus, it's a rotzen poshit. Someone says, what kind of house? I didn't think it through yet. Do you want a 20-story? Do you want a 20-room house? Do you want a mansion? So in other words, you could see everything that every creation, even human creation, begins with something that's more pashut, and then it begins to take shape and form. Chassidus talks about this barichas, how that travels. So essentially, in that context, the Rebbe Rashab is explaining that the Esses Firis Agnuzis is al derech zeh. The Eibishter made himself also in that way, so we should have something to understand, that it begins with pshittas mamish. In the pshittas begins to take shape, but you can't call it shape yet, because at that point, everything is like he calls it mu'uriv. That's the word he used, mu'uriv and ma'achdus. So that's the first example he gives in Perek Yutes. Then the Rebbe Rashab, and I'm just going to jump. I'm just going to read 2-3 lines that support just express what I just said. V'amoshel b'zeh yedua b'keches hanefesh shebevadim nimtzoim klulim be'etzem hanefesh v'sham yishkenu kulim yachad. The k'moishen b'izgalus had kol keich b'keli miyuchedes. K'mekeich ha'chochma b'meich ha'chochma v'keich ha'bina b'meich ha'bina v'riyah ba'ayin. V'k'moishen be'etzem hanefesh had yishkenu kulim yachad. The ime yeshen keiches mivdolim zeh mezeh. Zeh b'chinas eish v'zeh b'chinas ma'am kol mokum hari kulim b'yachad. Hainu liyeshim sham betachlis hazakus, most refined, utter refinement, beruchnius, and ethereal or spirit. Leimenei miksosei klal mikameshein achachach b'izgalus. So you can't even compare it. It's completely different level. Like even what it says in Gemara, it says, what does it say? To what day you could be mispal and a child is conceived, will become a zocher in the cave. Right? So what is it now? How could it be something that's not a zocher, not in the cave? It's a life, but it's not a zocher in the cave. Because it's in this state. It's still in a state of what called heyuli. There's a life there. In language of science, they will say the X chromosome and the Y chromosome haven't yet been defined. And by male, there's still possibility to go this way or that way. So you can give thousands of mashalim for this. The reason you need good mashalim is because we don't live on that level. Someone asks you, what level do you? We live in the world of what he says here, Keli miyuchedes, everything has a tziyud, everything has a mokim, everything has a zman. We don't relate to that. I remember, I don't know if I think I mentioned it here. I wish when we first started learning Chassidus as kids, whenever they start teaching, they start understanding. Bar mitzvah is less man the pole than nobody understands the Maamar. I mean, I haven't found anyone yet that understands. When I learned it with my son, I realized as an adult, I don't even understand, let alone. So, okay, fine. So we as they tell us, they're training us in the Asis, Chassidus. But certain things were not stated. I think I said in my opening Hagdamah to Chassidus, And no one ever said that you have to, when you move to Chassidus from Nigla, you have to move from spatial and time structures to things that are much more bedakus. Like, so I had a class of a Holoteda, one of the mashpim brought the whole class to my house. I don't know, because I must have said Sunday night on a program that, so he said, would I mind giving them a shtickle introduction? So I took out an apple from the refrigerator. Remember, did I say this here? I must have said it. Anyway, I'll say it again, it doesn't hurt. I took out an apple from the refrigerator, I put it on the table, and I said, like 60 guys, I said, so tell me, we're 14, 15 years old, how many apples can fit on this table? So I had a longer table. So of course they understood how to figure it out. You measure the apple, let's say 2 inches, whatever, 1.5 inches. You measure the table by width and by length, the square feet. And then you say, okay, how many apples can fit? Let's say on this table, 150 apples, 100 apples, whatever the number is. Good, all clear. Now I said, how many ideas can fit into the human brain? And I remember right away, they never thought of that because, at a younger age, we don't think abstractly. And right away, so they started say, so make the same calculation. How large is an idea? You made the apple is, let's say, 2 inches. What about an idea? So I remember one kid said, well, I don't know, an idea, is it a 1/2 inch? Is it a millimeter? They couldn't figure out how big it is. And what about the brain? The brain we know is smaller than this table. The brain is like more or less the size of the palm of a hand, a little bigger. The brain inside here. My point was not that I wanted to know how many ideas, because it's billions of ideas. So how can billions of ideas fit into such a small place when only 100 apples could fit on a table? The answer is because ideas take up different type of space. So it's not, I wouldn't call it ruchnius, but it's definitely a moshel. Now I took this moshel actually from Tafresh Nun. The Rebbe Rashab says, when he gives a moshel for what he uses an apple actually. He says an apple gashmi, a tapur gashmi occupies a certain amount of space. It has a color, it has a shape, it has a taste. You could even, then the Rebbe Rashab, what happens, you look at an apple, then close your eyes and be mitzayah the apple in your mind. You could have all the details there, even the juicy part, he doesn't say that. Every detail that you see in the apple, the tapur gashmi, you can have in your mind. What's the difference between the apple in your mind and the apple on the table or in your hand? Obviously, it's a difference. All the details are there, but can you call them tziyut or it's pshittus? The answer is, Lefi Erech, it's pshittus. On the other hand, it's an apple and not an orange in your mind. So how do you explain? Is it chalkus or is it ardus? This is an example, just an example. I'm not going to say this Esesphiris Sagnuzis Kamuvan, because that's already in the levels Lifnat Simpson. But for us, even this is already hard to imagine, because we don't think like this. I'm saying this not to be critical. I think until you come to realize that our minds are wired, we're programmed to think tangibly. We don't think like this. Chassidus is all about this, because someone says, where's Atzilus? Where's Bri? Where's Yitzhak? Where's Asiyah? Where in Neshamas? There are millions of Neshamas on Gan Eden. Where's this Gan Eden? So what's our natural inclination without thinking twice? Gan Eden is somewhere up in the sky. Someone says, where exactly and how far do you have to travel to get there? Then you come to realize, 1 second, the Neshamas are right here. But what does here mean? Here doesn't mean here. We mean here is this room right now in the Kollel, and we have Jungelite here, and we have people sitting at tables and chairs. So here is also a question. What means Mokim and Zaman? And without challenging yourself, it's going to be very difficult to understand most of Chassidus. Because Chassidus dwells all on the inner workings of things. Everything is on that level. Just to show you how far this can go. So now we say that the apple Gashmi, let's call that Asiya Gashmis. The apple Ruchni in your mind is Asiya Ruchnis. How about Yetzirah Ruchnis? So then you have to you're imagining the imagination of an apple. So Atzir of Atzir in your mind. Can you imagine? We can barely figure out what it's like just to have an imagination of an apple. Imagine having that imagination is just as far from the next level as the Gashmisdik apple is from the apple in your mind. See what I'm saying? So the more you go Baruchni, the more Hafshatadik it gets. Menachem Goldschmidt, who was good friends with the Rebbe's brother, Yisrael Aryaleib, said that he was the only person he ever met. He was able to explain all the dargas in Ishtalshalis till, I think he said, Ak or Akudim, in Asis without using the words from Chassidus. And I was able to explain Hafshata after Hafshata, because that's what it comes down to. If you say Chesed of Asiyah is, let's say, Chesed Gashmi when I do Tzedakah, or Achnasis Archim. So what's Chesed of Yitzira? It has to be something more dakazdik. And Chesed of Bria even more. Chesed of Atzilus. Can you imagine? We barely can move from Geshem to Ruach. The example I gave with the apple. To really appreciate the levels we're talking about, you have to be able to go level darga acha darga, hafshata after hafshata. And that's really the understanding. So going back to this point with Esesfiras Agnuzis, what he's saying is essentially, like I just read, in the Etzem HaNefesh, the keiches are all there, the sheichim kulim yachad, that's not Silas. Zemizeh. I'm reading from Perikutas. So now, imagine now, let's go back to the example I gave with the mind. You imagine an apple. Now I ask you to imagine an orange. In your mind, not in the table. On the table, an orange and apple are two separate entities. How about in your mind? The tzir of that you're imagining an apple, you're imagining an orange, what difference do they really have? Are they really different or they're not different? And it goes back again to the answer is it's not a black and white answer. On one hand, they're different because I'm imagining an apple, not an orange. On the other hand, it's imagination. What's imagination? It's just like taking sand and I shape the sand one way, then I shape it another way. So in Inyan, the gather of it doesn't seem to be a difference. So this is just an example where you begin to see that Esesfiras Agnuzis is essentially, it's all Elikus. But Elikus is so-called imagining existence. By us, I went Mamata Lamayla because that's the only way we can go. You start with a physical apple, and then you work to Aruchnizdik apple. But the Mamayla Lamata, it's the other way around. Atzmus and Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum is B'chol Tachlis Apshitas. And then conceptually, not in time. The next level is that it starts taking on some type of general tzir. Now, this we can talk hours about this, to be very honest, because what I just said now, many of you will say, one second, well, that's Esesfiras Agnuzis. I have difficulty enough to figure out Asiyah Ruchnis. What do you give me Esesfiras Agnuzis, But the Rebbe Rashab, as a good Rebbe, is laying out the whole picture. He's not going to just talk about the lower levels. He's talking on the highest levels and giving us some example to all of this. Now, so then he brings, the next is the Matan Torah. What happened by Matan Torah? So Matan Torah, we always talk about Matan Torah as all kinds of chidushim. Here, this piece here comes to tell you that Matan Torah, this Galus Alakus of Matan Torah wasn't just a mephis. You have Kriyas Yamsuf was a mephis. But Matan Torah says was a whole different change of consciousness. That the people experience something on a Koyachas Atzmim level. Because that's the next question anyone would ask. Okay, you told me it's Koyachas Gluyim, everything has a structure. It is Bekalim and so on. Is there ever an experience that you can experience the Nefesh, where everything is all together as one? So he gives now the example that Matan Torah, that's what happened. That's why the Shmiya and Riyah were able to be reversible. Because once you go into Etzem HaNefesh, and Shmiya and Riyah are like just they're pshutim, and they don't have this distinction as it is in the physical sight and sound. So then if you can access that, if that gets revealed, then suddenly you have an experience of what we call the synesthesia. But the word that meaning that you could see the see the sounds and hear the sights. So that's what he says. That's what happened by Matan Torah. It was this galus of keiches atzmim. That doesn't happen every day. That's a unique experience. The Rebbe Rashab afterwards now goes into a more discussion about two different ways to understand this. I don't know if you want me to go into that. If you want me to, I can. I'd rather talk more about coming back to the Esesfiras Agnuzis. It's up to you guys. If you want me to explain it further. This whole parentheses in the middle of Perikutas. Huh? Yeah. I mean, obviously it's negated. It's not a Maamar Amuzgar. It's negated Techen and Yoni. Huh?
It is a Maamar Amuzgar.
No, I mean technically, but I mean to say even.
Sorry.
I can go into it.
Possible. We had a hard time with it.
What?
Hard to understand.
Okay, so fine. Then I'll go into it, but then I won't be able to really do the Maamar of Keirach today, which is fine. We'll do it next week. It's all right, we're not going anywhere.
Give more time to the election.
Because remember, in Maamar Kedach, he starts giving more mashalim in understanding this, the two mashalim of the Asius and of ideas. Okay, so let's, I could even read it inside maybe. It's one page, it's the page, but it's the second half of Perikutes, right?
Yeah.
What page is it by you guys?
No.
Ma'am, okay. By me it's,
Huh?
huh? Right, it says on the side there. But any questions about what I said so far? No? Okay. Okay, so in parentheses says, I'm going to read it inside. Why not? It'll make it easier. Or l'cheira. So now he says, l'cheira, this experience by Matan Torah, where Riyah and Shmiya crossed over, which is not possible in the normal structure of things. You see sights and you hear sounds. If God forbid the person's ears were closed, they're not going to be able to see a sound. The eyes are made to see. Matan Torah, this all became one because there was a gili of Keiches Asman. So he says, l'cheira, this is even more than what we said before, that is coming from a b'chinas Asardus v'Sarvus Hanal. Because Asardus v'Sarvus is, you could say, it's all combined together. It's all in one place. The Eish Mayim can reside, the archetype of Eish Mayim, the Geder, or the Koyach let's say Koyach HaRiyah and Koyach HaShmiyah. But that doesn't say that they have different pu'ulas. There, we're not talking about the reason they reside together is actually because there's no pu'ula. If there was the pu'ula of seeing and hearing, they wouldn't be together. It's because you're going into the Keiches Atzmi, Koyach HaRiyah and Koyach HaShmiyah is like what I said, is just two forces of one nefesh. It's forces. It's not actually seeing or seeing. But here you're saying, Shari kol Koyach Peil Pula Hafchis. Here, something more happened by Matan Torah. It wasn't just a gili of all the keiches, like, he's going to give the example of a simcha, I think, a little later, in the same Perek.
The next Maamar.
The next Maamar, okay. The next Maamar gives an example, a person besimcha, so you have these galas ha-keiches, everything pours out. Like, usually a person, let's say, is more mesuder, so there's everything is beseder v'adroge. But when you besimcha, all these galas ha-keiches, bishpashtus. Here he's saying peich peil pula hafchis. The leilnus bar the in isarva sodak masha sheichnim yachad. The einam nikorim zemezeh mipnei shein bem tzir. That's fine. They don't yet have a shape, so therefore Riyah and Shmiya can be side by side, and they're not yet defined. Like I said before, if you ever see a fetus developing in early stages, not even the first one cell, even when it splits, and the fetus, you don't see right away arms and legs. If you look at the early trimester, the first trimester of a pregnancy, if you see a sonogram or an image, you'll see like almost like a ball. You don't even see the protein. So that's like l'mayla mitzir. So everything's resting together there. Sheichlim yachad. Because there's no say aval kol echad u'kameishu be'etzem mahusei. That's because they're all be'etzem mahusei and they don't have it Syria. But kan meaning by Matan Torah, harikei Paul Pula Havchis. This is even further. The Koyach HaRiyah is suddenly doing something that it usually doesn't do. The Koyach HaRiyah means actual gashmis. Remember, even though Matan Torah, that was his galus of Koyach Asmim, but B'Poel Maamar, their eyes saw a sound, whatever that means, and their ears heard a sight. So Poel Pula Havchis, the Koyach HaRiyah, Poel Pula Havchis, the Koyach HaShmiyah. So the Rebbe Rashab is going to say, I believe, two things here in how you explain this. Yesh Leimer, he says, that the truth is, this Pula Havchis is also only really due to the Pshittas Hatzir, meaning that there's no shape and form. So in other words, he's saying is that it's not the pshat that the eyes became the ears and sight became sound, is because you're going into the keches atzmim of the sight and sound, so they experienced it from the sheirish hadvarim. I'll explain in a minute. Let me read it and then I'll explain. That one. U'mashariyah tefes dover gashmi v'shmiyah tefes dover ruchni has it sir behem. U'b'pshitas hakeches atzmin ha'yirein es hanishma. So the Cheda, this is the first. This is the Cheda. He's a yesh shleimer. He's going to slug. He's going to say it's not good enough. This answer. So his answer goes like this: that what happened was two things that happened by Matan Torah. One was the Gili of Keches Atzmim. So Riyah and Shmiya there are equalized. It's Atzmi, and the fact that the Riyah and Shmiya in physical reality, the Riyah is Tefus the Ruchni of a thing, Shmiya the Gashmi of a thing. That's what he says here. I'm sorry, the opposite. Riyah is Tefus Gashmi and Shmiya Ruchni. You know what that means? I'll explain. When you see something, you see the actual object. If you didn't see it, you only hear about it. So it's a Tzir Ruchni. If you didn't see something and I tell you that this picture looks so and so, it's much more Ruchnizik than when you see it yourself. Because when you see the Dover Mamoshi. Here you have to make your own image within you.
What about hearing sounds? You also Dover.
In Hanami, that's what changed over. He's going to speak about this later here. That what happened by Matan Torah was that you were able to see Ruchni and hear Gashmi. That's exactly what was to say. In other words, that's what he's going to say. That's exactly what happened by Matan Torah.
Right, I understand, but you said that Riyah is Dover Ruchni.
No, Shmi is Dover Ruchni.
Sorry, yeah, but Riyah is Dover Gashmi because you see the physical object. Hearing about it, so you have to imagine it.
Right.
So the way you remind of Shmiya as being Ruchni because it's about the Riyah experience. What if you would hear sounds? Why is that any more Ruchni than seeing? Not hearing a description of what you saw, rather hearing sound. Irrelevant, independent of Riyah. Sound is enough.
Well, in other places it says because Bechlal Koil is much more Ruchni than Dover Gashmi. Even Koil, just Shmiyas HaKoil is more Eidel than like let's say you see the face of someone is one thing. If you hear them speak, you're like getting a little more of their spirit, so to speak. That's how I would explain it. I don't know if it's negay here, Mamish, but Al Kaponim. So what he's saying here is like this. That the bottom line is two things happened. One was the Gili Keches Atzmim. So at the end of the day, yes, they did see. They saw, for example, Kelis of Rokim, right? That was where it says Kelis of Rokim. And there was also what was the vision that it says in the Pasuk, Ma'aser Merkava, whatever it is. So they actually saw these and heard these things, but the sight and the sound came from the Keches Atzmim, not from the Keches Giluyim. That's what he says.
What does that mean?
What's the answer?
Yeah, that's the answer.
The answer is saying that what I was saying earlier, he said, that this idea that there was a reverse, that the Keches Apel Hofchim is not a contradiction to what I said, that's Pshittis. That's what he's basically saying. It's not relevant so much to the fact that they saw opposites. It's true that the Riyah was able to see sounds, but the bottom line is it was all mitzad the gili of the etzem hanefesh. So it's not necessarily a deeper level. The Matan Torah was the gili of keches atzmim, so the gili of like the esespheres like nuzis, for example. But Poel Mamish, there was a hofchizdika thing. That's how he's explaining. No, it's not. Don't read deeper into it and say it's a deeper level of pshittus. That's really what he's saying technically. But then he says, "Makom mokim kosher lemekim." Because then what you're saying, according to this answer, Yesh Leimer, you're saying it's incidental that they happen to see sounds and this. But he's saying no, the etzem riyah, even in etzem hanefesh, is different than the etzem of shmiyah. So in other words, it wasn't just in the technical part that they reversed each other. Even in Sheirish Advorim, in the Pshittas HaNefesh, riyah and shmiyah have a distinction and they crossed over. So in other words, so back to the question. So what does that mean? The chayda there, what's going on? They're not really opposites. That's what he's saying now. Is not just in the Giluyim, it's also in the Etzem. Okay, but time has run out, so, and I do have to run right now. What? No, so he's going to answer, what he's going to answer is, I'll just give you the answer. So he says, Okay, so it says Chachos Keches. I think we should leave it because I'd rather read it inside. We'll do it. We'll take time and patience. Okay, we'll stop here.
Is it Giloi of the Chassidus or Chassidus Chassidus or